What happens when love turns into something far more sinister? Today, we're diving into the disturbing world of Fred and Rose West, a couple whose horrific crimes shocked Britain. Fred's violent upbringing and dark secrets set the stage for a life of unimaginable cruelty. And when Rose entered the picture, things only got worse. Together, they unleashed horrors behind closed doors that would span decades, leaving a trail of victims and a legacy of fear. But in the end, it wasn't just their crimes that shocked the world, it was their betrayal of each other. Let's unravel the terrifying story of Fred and Rose West. Welcome to 10-Minute Murder. If looks can kill, then what can a cold and very public dismissal do? That was the question a husband facing his wife in the British courts would find out in the mid-1990s. The man himself was Frederick Walter Stephen West, otherwise known as Fred West. He was born on the 29th of September, 1941, on a farm in Herefordshire. With a name like that, I don't have to tell you it's England. His parents were Walter Stephen West and Daisy Hannah Hill, and he was born into a world of extremes. On one side was his father, a cold and strict disciplinarian. On the other side was his mother, a woman forever changed by the grief of losing other children before she would have Fred. This made her an overly cautious and protective woman, and one who would spoil her surviving children. But Fred had a very special place in her heart. He was her favorite child, the apple of her eye. Fred found it easier and more fulfilling to stay at home with her than he did going to school, where he achieved poor grades and had no friends. He actually left school at the age of 15, and by then he was barely literate, and his only future job prospects were working on the family farm. He was a socially awkward and stifled young man, but when he began going out to clubs with his younger brother John, his true nature would begin to emerge. Fred would often walk up to women and begin groping them, usually before knowing or talking to them beforehand. He later explained his actions by saying, "I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. Just kiss. I don't even wait. When you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything." Okay, he didn't really say that. Someone else said that. But he later explained his actions, Fred West did, in a claim that was denied by another of his brothers, that his view toward women and what was appropriate behavior towards them had already been shaped and warped by this stage of his life. And the culprit, he blamed, was none other than his overprotective mother herself. Fred claimed that his mother had introduced him to sex when he was only 12 years old. He also claimed that watching his very own father rape and molest his daughters led him to believe that this behavior was perfectly normal. However, we have to take these accounts with a grain of salt. Fred was also known to be a pathological liar, and it's possible that he created these events in his childhood to justify the unbelievably cruel deeds that were to come further down the line. We do, however, have the hospital records that can substantiate two major events in Fred's life. The first happened when he was 17 years old. He was involved in a motorcycle accident. Fred was left with a fractured skull and was unconscious for an entire week. The second came only 2 years later, when Fred would face the consequences of his actions. While out at a club with his brother John, Fred approached a young woman and grabbed her breast. Appalled, the woman turned around and punched Fred, sending him down 2 flights of stairs in the process. Fred ended up with another head injury, and his behavior went from bad to worse. In a later interview with the police, Fred admitted that since the age of 12, he'd been regularly engaging in bestiality with the animals on the family farm. But that, unfortunately, was not all that Fred was doing. It was in 1961 that Fred's 13-year-old sister, Kitty, approached their mother with a chilling and startling confession. It turned out that Fred had also been abusing his sister, and she was now pregnant. Fred was then arrested and openly admitted not only to abusing Kitty, but to many other young girls in the neighborhood as well. Kitty did eventually drop the charges against her brother, but he was kicked out of the family house all the same. Then, about a year later, Fred would rekindle an old flame. Her name was Catherine Costello, and she'd been one of the few women who'd actually appreciated Fred's advances at the clubs. They'd been in a relationship for a few months before Catherine, whose nickname was Rena, moved back to Scotland. When Rena returned to Fred, she was heavily pregnant with another man's child, but Fred agreed to take her in and raise the child as his own. They were quickly married, with Fred's younger brother John, his club buddy, being the only guest at the wedding. They then moved to Glasgow, where Fred and Rena would tell everyone that she had suffered a miscarriage. They then claimed to have adopted young baby Charmaine, who was actually Rena's daughter, but felt the need to explain why Charmaine was half Asian in a way that they believed didn't reflect poorly on them. This would only be the beginning of the racial abuse Charmaine would experience from the pair of them for the rest of her life. Charmaine was followed by another sister a year later. This time, Anna Marie was, in fact, Fred's biological child, but he treated her exactly the same way he treated poor Charmaine. Using iron bars and a bed bunk, Fred constructed a cage in the girls' bedroom. They would be forced to stay in there whenever he was home to keep them out of Fred's way. He also continued to have long and numerous affairs with multiple women during the course of his marriage with Rena. But when Rena found out, instead of divorcing him, Rena began having an affair of her own with a man named John McLaughlin. When Fred found out about Rena's affair, things turned violent. Whenever Fred caught Rena with John, or even just suspected that she'd been seeing him, he would beat her. John would often show up at the home to then confront Fred, and an uneasy truce settled between them all. Fred moved the family to Gloucester, although it would take Rena a few months to follow him down there. When she did, though, she brought with her two teenage girls named Aisha McNeil and Anne McFall. All three women, Fred and the girls, lived together in a small trailer, and Fred quickly began viewing all of the women as his property. Anne was spared for the moment, but Fred would beat Rena and Aisha. He also pressured Rena into becoming a prostitute to keep the family afloat. It's believed that during this period of time, he also began sexually abusing young Charmaine. Desperate, Rena then called John McLaughlin and begged for help. He immediately agreed to come and get Rena and the girls, but their plans were foiled by Anne McFall. Upon finding out that Rena and Aisha were running away, Anne reported them to Fred. He then raced to the meeting spot and told Rena that they were free to go, but the girls were staying with him. Reluctantly, Rena agreed, and she left with the warning that if she were to ever return, Fred would kill her. In July 1967, the then 18-year-old Anne was 8 months pregnant with Fred's child when she suddenly and mysteriously disappeared. Only a month later, Rena was officially back in Fred's life and living in the family trailer again. This new attempt at rekindling their relationship would only last for a year, and then Rena left for Glasgow again. 2 years later, Fred approached a young woman sitting alone at a bus stop. Her name was Rosemary Letts, and she had only just turned 15 years old when Fred began making advances. She dismissed him at first. She even at one point believed he was just a homeless man, but she softened when Fred weaved a story about being a poor widower. Rose then began spending more time at the West family trailer. By the time she was 16 years old, she was pregnant with Fred's child. There were, however, rumors that the father of the child was in fact her very own father, who had been diagnosed as schizophrenic. Rose ran away to live with Fred permanently, and shortly after, her daughter Heather Ann West was born. Unlike with his previous relationships, Fred had met his match. Instead of finding herself the victim of physical abuse, Rose became his partner. Together, they would dole out punishments on the girls, with Rose's punishments being the most severe. She was even known to turn on Fred, and at least on one occasion, came after him with a knife. But in the summer of 1971, Fred was actually behind bars, and during that time, firstborn daughter Charmaine disappeared. Rose proclaimed that she'd gone to live with Rena in Scotland, and when Fred was released from prison, he corroborated Rose's story. He even told Anna Marie that Rena had intentionally taken Charmaine and left Anna Marie. Quote, "She wouldn't want you, love. You're the wrong color." But Rena quickly realized that her daughter was missing and continued to visit Fred and Rose in the hopes of tracking her down. It was during one of these trips that Rena also disappeared. Fred and Rose were married only 6 months after Rena vanished, even though Fred was still technically and legally married to Rena. Months later, and Rose was pregnant again, while the family moved into a house on Cromwell Street. Upstairs, Rose would have her very own room, outside of which was a red light. If the light was on, she was not to be disturbed, and was more than likely busy selling her services to both men and women. When Rose's father found out that his daughter was prostituting herself, he began visiting her too. Unlike with Rena, Fred wasn't pressuring Rose into selling herself. Rose was doing so because she wanted to, and had come to an agreement with Fred. They would even sometimes work together, or Fred would also watch through peepholes he drilled into the walls. By 1983, Rose had 8 children, and at least 3 of which had been fathered by her clients. Fred raised them all as his own, but all of the children in the household were subjected to the same treatment. When they reached the age of 7, each child was presented with a list of chores to do to keep both Fred and Rose happy, and it was usually around then that the sexual abuse would begin. When Anna Maria was 8 years old, she was ordered down to the basement and told to strip. Rose herself then tied the girl to a mattress and gagged her. Fred then raped her, and when he was done, Rose followed Anna Maria to the bathroom. She then laughed and told her, "I'm sorry, everybody does it to every girl. It's a father's job." Anna Maria was also only 13 years old when Fred and Rose forced her into prostitution. In 1972, 19-year-old Linda Go moved into the family home, believing that she was to be a live-in nanny for the Wests. The very next day, both Fred and Rose began telling neighbors that they'd fired Linda for hitting one of the children. In 1973, a 15-year-old girl named Carol Ann Cooper went missing after a trip to the cinema with her boyfriend, and over the next year and a half, 4 more girls would go missing. In 1978, 18-year-old Shirley Robinson, who'd been living with the Wests, suddenly vanished as well. According to Rose, Shirley had been 8 months pregnant with Fred's child and had moved back to live with her father in West Germany. In 1979, 16-year-old Allison Chambers also went missing from the West household. And then Anna Marie ran away. With Anna Marie gone, Fred turned to his other daughters and said, "I made you. I can do what I like with you." While Fred continued to sexually abuse his own daughters, he spared his sons. The same, however, could not be said for Rose. Eldest son Stephen was informed, in no uncertain terms, that he was expected to have slept with his own mother by the time he turned 17. The children did what they could to protect each other from the abuse, but in so many ways there was very little that they could actually do. Heather began showing visible signs of physical and sexual abuse, and teachers at her school noticed. When they asked Heather if she was all right, she told them everything. When the other children came home from school one day, Fred and Rose told them that Heather had gotten a job in another country and that she had already left. They told her that they didn't expect to be hearing from her anytime soon. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months and years, and Fred and Rose began quipping, "You'll end up under the patio like Heather." Years went by, and the other children in the house believed that the line was just a joke. But that all changed in 1992. By then, rumors about a tape involving Fred and his 13-year-old daughter Louise led to a visit from the police. Louise corroborated the rumors about the abuse, which then led the police to interviews with both Fred and Rose. They managed to keep things together for the most part, but neither of them could keep their story straight about what happened to Heather. In early 1994, the police showed up at the family home with a search warrant. As the police searched the property, Fred approached Stephen and said, "Look, son, look after Mom and sell the house. I've done something really bad. I want you to go to the papers and make as much money as you can." He then told the police that he had killed Heather and she was, in fact, buried under the patio. According to Fred, he'd actually killed not just his daughter Heather, but Rena and Charmaine as well. Before he knew it, Fred had admitted to killing 10 women, but he claimed that Rose had no involvement in the murders. Rose was arrested anyway, and in a flash, she turned on her husband. Probably as part of her own defense, Rose gave Fred the cold shoulder whenever they saw each other in court. She even visibly pulled away from him and winced when Fred attempted to touch her. Fred was heartbroken. He then completely changed his story and told the investigators that Rose had been an active part of the killings. He then wrote Rose a letter and hanged himself in his own prison cell. Rose then had to face the courts on her own. She was found guilty and sentenced to 10 life sentences without the possibility of parole. That is 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, I'm the host, and thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you're a new listener, subscribe. Make sure you're also connected to 10-Minute Murder on all the social media platforms. And yes, I did it again. I did that thing where I'm starting out trying to make this episode 10 minutes, and then before you know it, it's like 15 minutes. 15 minutes have gone by, 16 minutes. I don't know what it is at this point. At some point, I just checked out and went, you know what? It's going to be what it's going to be. This rarely happens, but it's happened a couple of times within the last month, and that's my bad. But I didn't feel like I could leave anything out. Like, you tell me what I could have left out of this story. There's a whole bunch that I didn't talk about because there is so much to talk about in this story. But I did the best I could, and 15 or 16 minutes was about it. All right, my apologies. Thank you for listening to 10-Minute Murder.